Okay, so today I'm going to be presenting a session looking at international perspectives on values. I will specifically be focusing on a South Asian perspective on the idea of difference, but these ideas can be applied to other societies where there's more of a kind of a communal or collectivist approach to the ordering of human society. We're going to open with a video by Lei Manhua, a Chinese American, talking about his experiences of growing up and cross-cultural communication, really to just set the scene, and then we will move on to, I guess, a more theoretical overview and then zone in closer to some of the kind of differences between so-called Western values and South Asian values. So let's listen to Lei Manhua now.
I've been listening to all the different speakers today. I realize how the foundation of some content. And even today, as I'm standing there, how many times our institutions oftentimes have the value. I don't know what I'm talking about. And I was thinking that when I was growing up, by the way, my name is Semen Loss, and it means healing rights. And my parents took 2 months to find me. And on the day that I was born, what I want you to notice is that I didn't know what you did. Because for me, it's not coming out. How often I think it was because my father, when he came to this country, was called Lei Manhua. And his name was changed to Richard because his country was. I think it was my first dosage of what it was like in a multicultural nation. But when he can't pronounce your name, or actually what I've learned was if it wasn't in English, it was not possible. Unless it was French, Australian, or English. Today I think that that's part of what I want to talk about, is what I think it would take to change the world. I think it's being conscious, noticing that I didn't know. Maybe even for you to ask me, I love that. I hate that. Not that I don't think the world is beautiful. But I remember the children in Africa shared Chinese language. And I remember coming to school with this beautiful accent that looked like sea dogs, so such a black farm. I'm not trying to steal it. And what happened was I remember bringing it over only. I remember putting it underneath my chair because it covered my clothes, but thinking that we wanted to take it. And then I remembered some child in the back said, "Ooh, what's that horrible smell?" Then I realized that child was trying to fight. Then I was going to fight the process. And in the process, I started to think what was coming about it. I had never thought that it smelled. I had never thought that it didn't smell well. I thought it was a beautiful moment. And then the much fell by. I'll never forget this. So I took that notice of my fellow justice. I don't think you can look at the fire. I don't know how to look at it. But I didn't care about asked me whether to speak to Chinese to her. I remember the kids doing this. Jing Chang China Moon. The very first time I went home to look at my eyes, I realized that I was first time I got these beautiful colors. No wonder that even in Japan, they still have surgery on the eyes and even like Westerners. I got it. Today, when I'm standing in front of you today, my son is at the audience. I remember when my son was about to come out, his name is Martin. I remember he looks very much like my ex-wife and I, she's Dutch. We adopted him because we look like him. We mixed between the two of us. So when he went to school, preschool, we all thought that he was Chinese. And they kept thinking how smart he was. He was. They kept just saying how intelligent, how good he was learning his alphabet, things like this. And then one day, my team told him that he was not Chinese, thought he was mine. And then from that day on, we only talked about so. How did that happen? I think that as a Chinese man born in this country, born over in California, just next door, I think that when I started to realize the industry, I saw none of my teachers were Chinese. None of them were hardly people of color at all. They were minuscule, absolutely. But I started to realize that being different, that being bad. I started to realize all the different ways that I'm different. I remember it was a loss. Some people started saying to me, my gosh, you speak such good English. So even though my name was Jordan, even though I spoke perfect English, it was as if I was still I think this country has huge mythology. And the mythology is that our differences are bad. I don't think so. I think they're celebrated. I think that if you really value someone's culture, you really value their places, even today, our business becomes part of our culture. You see, I'm much more than Bruce Lee, much more than Chinese. I want to let you know today as I stand before you that it's not what I have in common with white people that makes me something. I have that my differences are beautiful, that they're wonderful. I got this gi that I wear that my people have to put on. I met this beautiful Tibetan shirt that I wear. It's part of my clothing, not just a costume to itself. But I want to tell you that the way that I move and I express myself is part of my people and my ancestors. When I was listening, watching the film of a young black man lost his best friend. I had lost my mother because the black man shot my mother by accident. I came to become a filmmaker because differences drove right by now in our school. It was caught down to one black man was caught down to the California school. But what happened was, while we were dealing with undocumented employees, decided simply to cancel. The consequence of that was he screamed and yelled on the doorknobs. Because he kept saying, this is my neighbor, this is where my friends are. So he canceled because of the school. 15 years later, I was married to my next door. I never believed it. When I found out my mom was being shot, my father said, see what I told you about black murderers, the robbers, John Kessler. And I kept thinking was, as long as we can turn it back, after that, so. I strongly believe that there is a strong family. And I wished people would ask to challenge Chinese child from my life. I wish in my classes, my teachers would ask a whole simple question. Simple. see that inside so much to see. Only they could look instead of putting this behind upset. Only they could realize that sometimes I wondered why some people did all the talking and simply interrupted other people. There wasn't always an opportunity for everyone to speak. Everyone could see. The other one is what I wish they could see inside. There was so much I noticed in each person. And when I became a teacher, I told my students, it's not that you can't, it's just that we haven't figured out the intention. I looked at every child on the first day that I taught. I wanted to know every single child, no matter what they were wearing. I always wanted to say, I love your energy. Woo! That's a badass tattoo. Tell me more about it. I'm feeling it. Whatever it might be. I didn't eat with the teachers. I ate out of lunch. Because I wanted to see the children in their own ways. What I'm going to tell you is that just a job to the devil. Segregated time is not a myself. In every one of our schools in this country. I want to tell you that the issues that we have with this president is not because of policies, it's because it's black. We say no to this black man, the policies that he even duplicates of the Republicans because he is. And I wonder who in this country is ever going to finally say that. But who in this country is finally going to say that no, it is not the opportunity for president. None of them Muslim, Chinese, gay, black, disabilities, poor. The odds of you becoming the president of the United States are not the same. See, the truth of it is we celebrate our differences. Everyone finds them. We don't lose them. And we're multi-heritage. So what happens? What happens to this next generation? They discover, take on our racism, our stereotypes. I remember I was in Harlem, and there was a group of, I was working with about 600 high school students. And I said, I'd like you to tell the truth how you feel about this. Finally, one Asian boy, a student from his born in Hong Kong, came down and said, okay, I'll tell you the truth. I'm scared of going to Harlem. I hear they rob you and they cheat you and the food's really bad. And, you know, you never want to go. I asked the students to please raise their hand how many of them are you back then? All of these students. Before they were all sitting together, but not just like today. We're all sitting together, whether or not we say hello and talk to each other. That's what we're having. In fact, for people who don't even know, probably at least one city. So what happened was, I was standing there thinking, well, what should I do? All of my life, I was about Harlem too. How do I convince this young Chinese boy and all these other students? So something came to me. So I said, who lives in Harlem? All these black students. I said, come on down. And what I want you to do is, I want you to tell this group, what do you love about Harlem? And they started to share one by one. The beautiful smells and the foods, and the uncles and aunts that shops, the beautiful music, all of art, the grandfathers, the grandparents, all this. It's absolutely beautiful. The evenings that just came alive. And one Asian student raised his hand and said, could you show me that Harlem? And then that student says, come on over. And another student raised his hand, and pretty soon almost the entire audience raised their hands to show me the Harlem. So that's exactly what's going on. You don't have to walk through that field to see it. You don't have to take a chance to get to know another person's life. We saw a film today of a young black man who lost his best friend. And I was so touched as I was listening to him the whole way. It's not enough to simply be touched. That loss will be with you for the rest of his life. And what I want to tell them, I think I was in Harlem, is that there's nothing wrong. There's something in our society that tells young black men, people of color, that we choose to be poor. That we choose minimum wage. I like strongly believe, unless once we start to create communities, taking care of each other, reaching, we have enough money in this country that we spend on work to care of. In closing, what I want to do is to share this. It's a story that I remember quite well. I finished high school, and I graduated as the president of Oklahoma. And one of my best friends said to me, "Mom, why don't you come out home with me?" He was black, and I'm not sure. My father told me never to go to a black movie. And I said, "Okay." So we kind of dragged my feet along. And as we were driving, he goes, "Well, Mom, catch up with me." And I said, "Okay, Daniel." I was really scared out of my mind of what might happen. As we were walking along, I realized to Don what I said was, "No, Don, I know this thing." As we got closer, I said, "I grew up in this thing. In fact, this is the same block that was born." And Don said, "I believe it." And we started to walk up to his house, and guess what? The house that he lived in. The house that he lived in. I looked at Don with tears in my eyes. And I said, "You know, Don, you're going to die in the future." I was told that. I'd like to use the text. Perhaps that is the secret chapter. Each and every place has to spend time.
Hey, that was a really powerful video by Le Manoir. There's lots that you can, I'd really encourage you to rewatch it. There's lots that you can kind of unpick, lots of valuable questions, discuss them in groups with your friends. It's just so powerful. I mean, I think a couple of things that I just wanted to pull out was, he said that, in America, but I would say in this would apply to the UK, this idea of, is being different really about being not white? So what's the kind of standard of what it means to be a citizen or a human? And then anything that's not white is kind of like exceptionalized. He also talked about the idea of noticing and not noticing what we pick up, and sometimes familiarity can actually distort or make invisible things that are different. Very powerful opening lines about why people in the audience, and there were lots of them by the sound of it, that laughed when he said that his name was not Le Manoir, but he actually got called Gary, and why he didn't laugh about that. He didn't think that was funny. And you'll notice there the power of naming practices, and again in terms of values about how particular kind of cultures or names are seen as troublesome, that we don't bother to step out and incorporate sounds, names that are different from what we might be familiar. And the other thing that he probably didn't emphasize as much, and I've certainly had these conversations with students over the years about this, international students who've come in and maybe used a common name like Iris or Lily or Rose, for example, and I've asked them, is that your real name? Or, and they'll often say, no, that's the name that the immigration agent or somebody else, a friend maybe, has suggested I should use because it's easier. And how often even people themselves will go along with that practice. And I know there's no straightforward response to this, and this is about the engagement. I mean, certainly in those situations, I often ask the student, well, are you happy with that name? Do you want to use that, or would you prefer to use your own name. So, you know, invariably, actually, I should say to you that most of the students I spoke to, not all, but most actually said, no, I actually would like to use my own name. And I then went on to talk about, you know, the capacity to, for if people really value and understand differences to make the effort. I think he also talked about the issue that, you know, multiculturalism or social inclusion is not just about special holidays. So we need to think about that really, you know, if we're really committed to kind of social justice based values of inclusion, it's really about how do we incorporate differences into our practice. You know, and the video also points out to the fact that, you know, people's attitudes are shaped and preconditioned by prejudice, including stereotypes, for example, around intelligence. I think his example of his Guatemalan son is a case in point that even positive stereotypes can have prejudicial outputs. The Guatemalan son was assumed to be Chinese, and we have stereotypes about Chinese being exceptionally intelligent and high performance students, and how, again, a great story, how once he said, well, actually, I'm not Chinese, I'm Guatemalan, how, again, expectations that his son would only be good at things like sport. So anyway, I want to, as I said, I want to move through. We'll first talk about kind of like the researcher or the practitioner standpoint, and I'll explain what I mean by that, and then we'll move to some kind of theoretical stuff, and then kind of ground down to some specific examples. So what do we mean by standpoint? I guess, look, it's a fairly complex area, but the fact is that we are all positioned by, you know, the kind of baggage that we bring with us, our where we're positioned in relation to kind of race, sex, you know, sexuality, class, culture, etc. So we very much are embodied researchers, we're embodied practitioners. There's a familiarization, so we need to kind of engage in reflection on where we're coming from, you know, what is our investment in this area, and to recognize that people might have different investments in the topic. For example, the talk by Le Manoir, clearly he has an investment because of his lived experience around issues around cultural exchange, racism, and prejudice. However, if you are coming from a different standpoint, maybe an assumed whiteness where issues around racism and cultural interchange aren't part of your reality. However, with a knowledge and a commitment to social justice, you have made a commitment to become an ally and reflect upon issues of difference, issues of marginality, sorry, issues of white privilege. What does that actually mean? So we all bring, you know, we all bring our own histories to our practice, to our research, in fact, and into our lives. So I think maybe I should say here a little bit about who I am, because I am giving this lecture and I've made decisions about what I'm going to focus on, what slides I'm including, what topics I'm covering, and the way in which I'm approaching the topic and the issues. So in terms of my own experience, I was born in Australia to a Sri Lankan mother and a Scottish father. So I would categorized and certainly see myself as a person who's biracial, although I am white appearing. I probably, to be honest, would identify as someone who has been influenced and identifies with as being more of a South Asian. I don't really know much about my Scottish background, and that already automatically for some people raises issues, because I've certainly had people in the past say, well, look, you know, you're white appearing, why do you choose to identify as Asian? So automatically we've got this issue about, well, race, culture, and appearance. And I used the word biracial earlier. Certainly when I was growing up, there were more nasty terms to describe my situation, such as, you know, half caste, mongrel, nearly white. So my own perspective is, I guess, is shaped by the history of culture, the history of racism, and what to do with people such as myself and others where there's been so-called race mixing. Where do we put these people? Which category do they fit into? There's almost an obsession about categories of race and classifying practices. Okay, so in the last, probably since 1989, I've been doing work in Sri Lanka around intercultural issues, around colorism. So I want to also think about, in terms of values then, I think we do need to get away from the idea that values are somehow intuitive. What do I mean by that? That sense that, oh, well, there's common sense values. And in fact, often people will, and students will argue, well, values are very much a common sense thing. It's, it's what we think is good or bad or ethical or normal. So I think we need to understand that our approach to life, our world outlook, is actually shaped by, for example, our families and how values are transmitted there, the shape and form of our family and other kinds of families that we're exposed to when we're growing up, neighbourhoods, communities of origin, and even schooling. Schooling practices very much shape our values. And, sometimes there are collisions. For example, in England at the moment, there's some fairly hot debates around schooling and to what extent should government schools, well, not to what extent, government schools are actually commissioned to introduce equalities practices under the Equalities 2010 Act, and that includes valuing all sorts of different families, including LGBT folk, and teaching children in primary school that LGBT folk exist and that there are the different family forms and the importance of social inclusion and equality. And what that's kicked off is a debate by, from parents from a number of religious communities who say that, well, I don't want my child being taught about these people, our religious traditions oppose those people or believe that those people are sinful, and this collides with my religious values. So we get these kind of dilemmas. I don't necessarily want to be sidetracked into that debate. It could make an interesting lecture in its own right, but again, we've got a decision that's been made by the education authorities to instill particular value practices, and in this case, values about the protected characteristics under the Equalities Act. So schools are there to socialise students into those realities. The other thing I want to mention also, in terms of this, getting away from this idea that values are intuitive, I mean, our very ideas about civility and politeness are very much culturally manifested. In fact, sometimes it's kind of intergenerational. A couple of other areas we have, again, and often these practices are unnamed. There's something that young people are socialized into: use of space on territories, how we use spaces in the public and private arena. Are there certain parks or areas or corners where, only young men hang out, or is there a territory for women? In Australia, for example, there were a couple of years ago, in fact quite a few years ago now, that we had what was known as the Cronulla riots. Cronulla Beach is a famous surf beach in New South Wales in Australia, and the riots were really in many ways caused by this issue of ownership of spaces on the beach, and a number of white Australians felt that young men from the Lebanese community were taking over that beach. And they sent out text messages, and there was a really nasty race riot around territories and space. It's interesting, if you are one of these beach people, a bit hard to sometimes talk about in the Scottish context, but you know, whether beaches themselves have ever been democratic spaces. We have cultural rules about how men and women interact with each other. And an example might be, and I was going to put it in the slides, but I forgot, is, you know, you could have two pictures of two men holding hands. For example, in Pakistan, you could have two men holding hands in Soho in London, and we would read those situations differently. So issues around body intimacy and space. The other thing that will become clear as we go through this is, you know, even values, that intuitiveness, and as I said, we need to reject that idea, really based on the ideas of self. How do we understand the idea of self and individuality, ideas of family and obedience? And finally, before we kind of move on a bit, is just to some of the kind of questions then about deference and values. We might want to think about, there's other questions, there's lots of questions here that come up when we do this topic, but who is my neighbour? Who do we understand that to be? Who is my neighbour? You know, who is a stranger? And the idea of strangeness, what the other, what's our response to humans that we haven't encountered before or are unfamiliar? What portrayals do we draw on? You know, these portrayals in the newspapers and social media, movies, music videos. And again, coming back to Les Manoir, I mean, the encounter of kind of, you know, wanting to visit the neighbourhood of Harlem or go to people's houses. So I think the issue of standpoint is absolutely significant. And in fact, you know, Santos talked about the idea that there can be no sense of social justice without epistemic justice, without equality of knowledge. Epistemic is to do with knowledge systems. So to realize that there are other ways of thinking, there are other frameworks of knowledge, and indeed there are other sources other than a Western source of writings of ethics. And it's really important, if we are really fully committed to social justice, to open up our minds. Now, this is a really heavy quote. I'll read it out and then we'll try and unpack it. We won't spend lots of time on it because we've got a couple of slides unpacking it a bit. So, modernity, usually considered to be a product of the European Renaissance or the European Enlightenment, has a darker side which is constitutive of it. Modernity as a discourse and as a practice would not be possible without coloniality. And coloniality continues to be an inevitable outcome of modern discourses. This is an example of two sentences that are absolutely packed with some really important stuff. So the idea of modernity, we are moderns. I mean, even that in itself, I guess, has this value that somehow the people that went before us, our ancestors, were somehow unenlightened, naive, a bit ignorant. So the idea of being modern, I mean, it has a kind of sense of being advanced, and that has its origins in the European Enlightenment. And again, without going into some kind of snapshot history, the whole notion of the Enlightenment, which was in the 17th century roughly, France and England and Scotland, was really about a new idea of breaking away from the power of the churches to control life and control reality, and that man, and I'm using that term deliberately, that man should be ruled by reason and his own reason. So the environments of values of equality and liberty, etc. So this and ideas of democracy and secularism. I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff that hangs off this Enlightenment side of things. So that there was that idea of modernity and kind of Western civilization and this kind of advancement, and the idea that we are progressing, even ideas of progress, and to rid the world of superstitions, to be ruled by independent ideas based on evaluation, deduction, etc. And the point in this phrase is that modernity itself as kind of a discourse, as an idea, as an ethic, as a logic, is not possible without coloniality. In that sense, it's always comparative, that modernity always kind of differentiates itself and sets itself up, Western values, Western civilization, against the opposite. The backward nations, those that live in darkness, it's often there's the phrases about the backward nations and the darkness of Africa that just needs light shone on it. Even though we've talked about getting rid of religion, that wasn't actually achieved. So sometimes it's also that idea of shining light in the darkness, which comes up in the Christian New Testament, that these nations that live in ignorance, in darkness, need the light brought to them. The light of Western knowledge systems and Christianity. So we've got this kind of this idea that to improve the world and to advance the world in terms of democracy. I mean, the democracy project is often put out there as the premier, as the optimum way of governance. That is something that modernity it feels compelled to spread to these colonial kind of realities. This idea of the democratization project certainly has been strong within the area of United Nations foreign policy. And also, I guess these days, which kinds of knowledge systems are spread, and again, that kind of idea of working with countries and working with individuals, sometimes in a compulsory way, sometimes in a more subtle way, to bring them advancement and progress. So the two kind of intersect in many ways. So what I've got 3 slides here, and I said this is the kind of theoretical approach. I think it's really useful when you find a schema. So this is a schema developed by a sociologist by the name of John Law at Lancaster University. And what he was looking at is governing from a distance. So this idea then, how do you govern different countries that are thousands of miles away, or even people you might think about even the situation in the UK where you have a government at Westminster. How do you govern the population, for example, at the Shetlands or other places? So what John Law talked about and developed a schema. And why I like it is because he uses 3 Ds: documents, devices, and drilled people. And I'm going to go through those. Just in terms of context for this, I mean, I think the schema is good because it can be used in so many different ways to kind of think about the issue of values and our practices. This schema helps us bring some of our practices up front to foreground them. But the background to his development of this is quite obscure. I might just mention it just because, again, it raises questions, and if you can think about this, the specificity of this and how it can move to the general. So what he was looking at was Portuguese colonization. Now, Portuguese colonialism, Portuguese imperialism happened in the 15 and 1600s. Portugal's quite a small country in what is modern day Europe. And sometimes we because we're familiar with the imperialism, Western imperialism, Portuguese, Dutch, and then the English, as well as the Spanish, I guess, is we take it as a given, but actually don't think about how it was maintained. So, you know, in the era of when the Portuguese were expanding, you might think, well, how did they manage to go from this small country and, you know, have colonies set up in places as far away as Brazil, for example? How did that happen? Not only how did they get there, but how did they maintain this system? So this is what he talked about. Well, he talked about the fact that in the Portuguese experience, technologies such as larger boats enabled the Portuguese to travel further. They had a good bureaucracy that was able to have common rules, and people were trained, so there was kind of reducing the kind of possibility of uprisings and mutinies, remembering that people couldn't just pick up the phone and say, hey, this bunch in this colony are kind of getting very cranky and getting angry. It could take, you know, up to 6 months for communications to be delivered to the mother country. So that's the context. Let's have a look at how it might apply to kind of the idea of difference. Okay. So devices here. So you need to think about devices as more than just machines. Okay, so devices are technologies, and technologies can be practices. Let's have a look at this. So the first one would be modality of talk. So the different kinds of language in order to communicate with a range of people and have a consistent understanding of what we say, travel across different and multiple social worlds that everybody understands what's being said and the intention behind it. There are language filters. So again, if you look at, for example, the development of American English in contrast to English, you know, at the time, American English is not necessarily something that evolved. I mean, it is evolving, but it was part of a conscious decision by, I can't remember the dates, but the people who put out the Webster's Dictionary to differentiate the US language from the mother country, the English, and that was a nationalistic move. It was to say we don't need the old country way of doing things. So it was quite a conscious idea. If you think about language filters now, translation devices, the choice of language on software that you use, our whole world is saturated in platforms developed by Apple and Microsoft. There are values, choices of language that are framed into those systems. Even, for example, if we're putting together project or practice documents, speaking forums, there are language filters that talks about the way in which we give presentations, for example. Even so, it's not just the talk, but the order of knowledge and the way in which you present it, or a way of putting practice together. There are also administrative reporting systems, and that's really important, the kinds of coding. You may need to look at, for example, the International Classification of Diseases, ICD-11 is the current version, I think. Things like every disease has a code, has a number, and in fact, Ian Hacking talks about the fact it's now illegal to die of old age because that's not in the coding. It has to be attributed to some kind of epidemiological form of coding. So, and the fact is you should be, and increasingly actually in more of an universalized society, we are finding, whether it be things like the ICD or Sustainable Development Goals, social determinants of health. All these things have codings and reportings systems, which allows for some uniformity, but then it can erase particular cultural understandings of difference. And later on in the slides, I'll briefly talk about that in respect to disability. Funding and donor aid makes a huge difference to, it's a technology that makes a difference to how we harmonise difference and communicate with each other. Last week I showed a video which talked about the fact that you know, a women's group, they kept changing their kind of identity because of the funding basis. So first they went in for funding as a women's group, and then it was a BAME, Black, Asian, minority, ethnic group. So that was, again, the funding that changed their identity again. And then further along it became a Muslim women's group, again, because that the funding. So you've got these kind of shifts. I think the other thing I want to talk about, and in terms of devices, there are dominant Western knowledge systems about, for example, what is scientific, what is objective knowledge, the way in which we argue things. For example, just in one obscure area, but you know, the idea, for example, of truth, what do we mean by that? Are we talking about single truths? Whereas, for example, in Indian philosophy, there is the idea that you can have simultaneous truths. So you might have even 4 truths operating side by side, which is kind of a bit strange. And the idea of academic dependency, where, you know, most of the funding and the ownership of journals and publishing houses, funding organisations for practice occurs in the West. So there is this dependency on Western knowledge. You'll find this even with university systems. We've got a global system of university rankings. You know, why is it that, for example, that, you know, a university in Brazil that really has high expectations about what students should know and the quality of the teaching, the hours, contact hours, the research outputs. Why is it that, generally speaking, Brazilian universities are lower down the rankings than Western and indeed US universities? Have a look at, when you look at the rankings, why is it that US and UK universities are at the top of the rankings? Are they really better, or is something else going on? So I spent a little bit more time on that than I had planned. Again, some of this, you know this, but it's about putting theory behind it to make sense of what's going on. So the idea of drilled people, you know, human beings are being individual or a bit dangerous. We can decide, we can change from minute to minute, hour to hour in terms of what we want to do. We can be conforming, we can ask questions. Indeed, we can be outraged, and we can engage in uprisings. So in order to look at social ordering and governance and control of society, you need drilled people. And that drilling, you think about a sergeant's drill, it's definitely got militaristic overtones to it. And law talks about the fact that drilled people have to have similar conceptual frameworks and mind maps. In other words, there are particular, like when you go and do a job, there's certain knowledges that you need to achieve. It might be a technique of intervention. It might be a philosophy of education. Yeah, it might be a particular approach to consulting with the community, ideas about partnership, different kinds of practice frameworks that you use. And they're there to not just promote a particular orientation or philosophy. That is true, but they're also there to make sure that everybody is walking the same walk and is on the same path, yeah, and that people know what to do, and supposedly all reading off the same page. So it's kind of researchers and government, human service provisions. And it might be, for example, and again, that one example might be the area in social policy. We may have a particular conceptual framework that's dominant about the idea of poverty. What is poverty? How is it measured? how do we alleviate poverty? You know, you need to look at some of the issues around the the idea of an educational attainment gap. You know, what is it? What are the causes of that? These are the drivers often of government policy, and then if you're working in a statutory authority or a not-for-profit, will drive practices. And there's a common language that's there. And actually, having been a civil servant myself, one of the issues is not what you say, it's how you say it. You need to be using these conceptual frameworks, and common languages to even get a foot in the door. Sometimes these kinds of strategies for governing the population, how we group people into categories, is something that, as a consequence, individuals internalize themselves. So you might, for example, be classified as a disabled person. Indeed, you might even be classified as a vulnerable disabled person or a protected adult. These kinds of categories can end up shaping one's sense of self. Even in the UK, the acronym BAME, or it used to be BME, British, Asian, Minority, Ethnic. Sorry, not British, sorry, that was a Freudian slip. Black, Asian, Minority, Ethnic, or Black, Minority, Ethnic. These are government classification systems. You know, I've had some really interesting conversations with folk who've come from overseas about, wow, I didn't see myself as Asian, or what's the difference between an Asian or an East Asian, minority, ethnic, what does that mean, and how does that fit alongside the other groups? So these kinds of issues where people are internalizing this or self-identifying, or indeed resisting these kind of categories. But either way, these kind of enumerative practices, these classificatory practices, shape and understand our ideas of difference. The other thing in terms of drilled people is this idea of universality. As I said to you, I mean, you should be able to go, particularly in transnational organisations, go around the world and have these kind of people who have practices and procedures which allow for, I guess, a smooth, uniform sort of governance, but then how does it respond to cultural particularities? Does it kind of erase them? Is there a collision? What's going on? Is there some kind of indigenization where cultural practices may absorb some of the external practices that come in? And of course, law talks about the fact that the primary way that values are transmitted is through documents, through treaties, through codes, through definitions, through funding guidelines, and rules, legal rules. So if you think about it, even institutions like the legal system contain legal norms and values and ethics. Yeah, I mean, even the notion of the reasonable man, or nowadays the reasonable person in law, that's often used as a benchmark. How would the reasonable man have acted in this situation? You know, the question, for example, like in the area of assault, would be, how would the reasonable man act in the circumstances of the accused? So we've got this kind of benchmark stereotype or kind of exemplar of what the reasonable human being would be, and sometimes that is very rarefied. And again, I just wanted to kind of point to the idea of the captive mind, in the sense that, and hopefully, you know, Le Manoir kind of pointed this out, the whole issue of difference and cultural difference and values is not a level playing. It's not a level playing field. It's not like you can go into a shop and say, oh yeah, look, I'll have some English values and some Scottish values and Indian and Portuguese, whatever. We're not talking about equalities of cultural exchange here, where very much living in a world that is absolutely dominated by Eurocentric Western thought. And we've talked about the documents, devices, and drilled people, how that is grown and centered, and how kind of it reinvents itself. It's often said that, in fact, colonial powers don't need guns and weapons to colonize anymore, although that's clearly happening. But you can colonize through knowledge systems that you need to have a particular basis for knowledge to get about in the world. So, for example, the domination of English is a case in point. It's in terms of opportunities and global mobility, you really need to have English or French or Spanish to get around in the world. So the idea of the captive mind picks up the fact that, as I said to you, this is not a free trading environment, that in fact Eurocentrism actually privileges the idea of the West. The West is best, including Western knowledge systems. So if you are in a country that's outside of a Western paradigm, what happens is the idea, and Chakrabarty talked about this, provincializing Europe. What he meant by that was that you would always be looking at Europe or Western systems as being the benchmark, as the standpoint, as the ideal, right? So the captive mind then refers to ways of thinking that's dominated by Eurocentric thought. It imitates it in a very uncritical manner. And in fact, often during the colonial eras of the 1950s and 60s, you often found a situation where people who had been colonized, often in many ways through this process of the captive mind and internalization, often ended up emulating being British more and being more British than the British. So you kind of often had this kind of very sense that if I individually and as a community emulate, what white folk do, how they speak, the accents, the kind of manners, the kind of careers that are valued, the social ordering and social ranking, somehow that will be a gateway for me and my family to get a better life. So this idea of the captive mind then, often what it will do is that even if you are in a university in one of the African countries or one of the Asian countries, that you will often privilege and prefer books and approaches and systems and models and training that are written by white folk from the West. So you often possibly won't even know about your own country, or indeed writers and practitioners and theorists from your own country situation writing about that, writing about the local conditions. You often won't even get exposed to that. And I can remember last year reading an article written by a Nigerian sociologist who was doing some really interesting work around Nigerian understandings of community, and he said it was impossible to get his work on the curriculum, on the syllabus at Nigerian universities. So the idea, as I said to you, with this is this academic dependency, that Western knowledge is the best and more available. There also, sometimes it's really upfront, sometimes it isn't. This idea that Western values are more democratic, that non-Western values often are hierarchical and backward and inferior. Okay, so we need to kind of watch this idea of the democratic project, and also the idealization of Western values. You might want to think about a case in point if you're talking about First Nations, first world nations, and I use that word critically, like how democratic in terms of how you understand that word is the United States. How democratic, how much is there a commitment to equalities in a country like the United Kingdom? So, as I said, there's generally this idea that a Western worldview, it becomes normalized. That's the way things are. And again, that comes back to the idea of that intuitive thing. There wouldn't be any other way of understanding individuals and their relationship to society and their relationship to self, that there is this unconscious acceptance of Western ways at looking at things and Western ways of judging things. And the point that I make in my second comment there, in many ways, it's people who've been raised in the West, like myself, we are socialized in this way, and it's just assumed to be natural. Of course, everybody would think and have those values. Again, the issue about values is that these practices become part of a moral imagination about what's good is right. I mean, you think about the issue about, why do bad things happen to good people, how we understand concepts of people deserving, the whole idea of just desserts, what are the foundations for our justice practices, the issues about fate, ways in which we need to look at the specifics, the idea of contingency, to look at this, the specific place and the specific moment and the specific environment, to look at ways in which individuals adapt and adjust and cope. And again, this slide's really looking at the idea of ethics and values, and we need to be have our little crap detectors up and watch generalizing kind of moral points or moral and ethical systems. Again, going against this idea of this intuitiveness by looking at practice, ethics, values within a contingent context. And we say contingency here is to look at the specific situation that we're practicing and working in. Where is it located? And why I'm saying situation over and above location is it might be what else is happening, what's the time, what else is happening during that time. It could be a month, it could be a particular year. Maybe, for example, there were stabbings 2 or 3 weeks ago. Maybe some new law and order rule had been brought in. So the temporality, the idea of time and situation, we need to look at it. Why this time? What's happening that's impacting upon this situation? Are there particular tensions or moral panics around that are plugging into issues? So we need to really understand this idea of emergent ethics then says that, well, when we're looking at value differences and the development of ethical responses is these kind of ethical views emerge from our efforts to come to terms with concrete practices. So relationship between practices and ethics, there's always a conversation, there's always a dialogue happening between various parties, the actors, and the situation at hand, and our reflection upon this. And one example would be if you're looking at school ground bullying. I was watching a YouTube video the other day that talked about the fact of, that bullying initially was like, related to being punched or, and then it was extended to abuse. And then the speaker was critical that now, anti-bullying strategies now cover people who feel excluded. So if you're excluded from a situation that constitute a form of bullying, and what this speaker was doing was talking about this kind of treating, actually what they were talking about was the idea that we are training young people who will become adults to see themselves as fragile, and this idea of these kind of expansive bullying practices, anti-bullying practices, which are in many ways shaping and crafting and forming how we see ourselves as adults. But this sort of dialogue is necessary then to look at what's going on here. Statements like that, whilst there might be some credibility, those arguments are actually quite dangerous, because I think from my own perspective, I think they diminish the reality you know, people's experiences of bullying, about all sorts of violence. Violence is not necessarily just reduced to physical violence. The idea that there are coercive practices, that people, there's psychological kind of issues, there are inequalities in situations, that we actually need to look at that, so we actually don't negate and diminish people's experience of violence. And certainly in the case of that, speak of kind of like throwing the baby out with the bathwater and suggesting, well, you know, almost there was an implication there is no such thing as bullying and people need to kind of grow up and get over it and tough it out. So the idea of emergence ethics is, it really needs to kind of come in there and help us reflect upon these kinds of issues. And, you know, as I kind of just alluded to in that last example, we need to kind of look at whose narrative and whose experience are we talking about here. I'm sure that, for example, you know, somebody who experiences bullying, you know, based on disability or based on race, you know, often there's a perception that unless someone's actually physically harassed or there's actual violence, it's not so bad in terms of the kind of verbal taunting. But we know, in fact, from research that, you know, practices that involve name calling can actually be injurious speech. It can result in people having internalizing these kind of negative views, and which shapes and forms and you know, helps kind of build up a very negative self-image. And again, going back to the Lei Manoir video, I mean, his experience, that lunchroom experience, is an example of how he, as a result of being laughed at and somebody calling out the fact of, you know, the smelly lunch, etc., he changed and adapted his practices. So there's kind of like these kind of turning thresholds and turning points. So I don't really want to spend a lot of time on this slide. You can kind of read it at your leisure, but just to say that I mean, the particular kind of hegemony and hegemonic and dominating sense of Western ethical systems, Western values, it's so dominant. And one example would be that when we're looking at other cultures, and it might be storytelling or practices or even renderings of history, often we talk about these things in terms of myths and folklore, superstitious practices. So there's kind of, again, a kind of hierarchical ranking. If in societies which have been well and truly colonized, and remembering that colonization for many countries was an experience of over a period of 500 years, that's a lot of time where, you know, communities were not, often prohibited from using their own languages. Sometimes there was various degrees of religious suppression, non-Christian religious suppression. English was the dominant language. A Western system of laws and architecture and town planning and schooling was often imported into these countries. And really then it becomes very difficult then, if you've been totally inculcated within that system, to actually find alternative ways of doing and thinking, different ideas of time. Anyway, I think I'll leave that slide. I won't particularly go through that in lots of details. So I just really want to move on to now some sort of practical examples. And again, you know, I want to put a disclaimer here in the sense of talking about South Asia. South Asia is a region. There is a multiplicity of cultures and countries, and they have different colonial histories. They have different religious traditions, different ways of approaches to social ordering, and so we need to be very, very careful here. One thing that we can say, probably as a generalization in South Asian cultures, in terms of values, religion's not something that you do. It's something that is something that you are, that you become. Religion affects all the rhythms of life. It's not just outside of the person. So I think the notion of religiosity, very hard word to say, infuses cultural practices in South Asian countries. I also should say to you, I will also be talking a little bit about Southeast Asia as well. So I'm not, I'm rearranging the map a bit here. So first, one difference might be the concept of time. That's often a very different way. Firstly, the whole idea of a multi-life narratives. So in many cultures, particularly within Buddhism and Hinduism and Confucianism, there might be the idea that it's not this life that you're looking at that just shapes and forms your personality. It's the inherited life from your previous life. So the idea of multi-life narratives, that you have had previous lives and then you will have also other lives in the future. So that very much affects how concepts of time and the person. Okay, so the time takes on quite different dimensions. The other thing is, you know, just trying to think, it was now, I think Anthony Giddens, who's a sociologist, talked about the three major inventions in the West around the Industrial Revolution, and I'm not going to go into the three, but one thing he talked about was the mechanization of time and the role of the development of the watch, that you could actually compartmentalize time into a 12-hour, 24-hour clock, and that regulated how people perform work and how they performed activities. The idea of time in some South Asian cultures is very much influenced by the seasons, but also influenced by things like traffic and travel time and community time. So it's a very different concept of time there. I think the other thing is some of the differences around the idea of shame. I put shame, not guilt. So I think one of the things that particularly comes from the Judeo-Christian tradition is this idea of guilt, which is that sense of self-awareness of something that you've been wrong, you've done wrong, or there's some remorse, something that you're ashamed of, and guilt is very much something that's internalized. It's about what's happening inside yourself. Yeah. Now, traditionally within Confucian and Hindu and Buddhist kind of ethics, there isn't necessarily a sense of guilt. There's been lots of debates around this. If people do feel a sense of guilt, sometimes that's, again, an example where maybe Western moral values have kind of crept in through colonization, but there is definitely a sense of shame. Now, how is shame different from guilt? One of the ways of shame is really not about how you feel, but how you are seen by others. Yeah, so shame moves outwards. Guilt moves inwards. This is very much simplifying it. Guilt moves inwards, but shame moves outwards. This idea about feeling disrepute, it's a terrible experience of feeling shameful about how you are seen by others. And in fact, even your actions then affect others. So that comes back to, I guess, this idea of the individual and what is the self. So this idea in the West, in the Western tradition, that there's this idea of atomistic man, that I am my own command center. I am, I exist, therefore I am, kind of thing. A separateness. Whereas in societies which are more communitarian, what's often called family state societies, this idea that I am who I am in relation to my sense of self comes out of my identity with a broader group. That is my kin family. So I do not have an existence outside my kin family network. So again, the idea, as I've said here, it's not who am I, but how am I? How am I seen by others? And you get a sense then, and this has come out through the family kin system, and I think this has come particularly like countries like China, Korea, Japan, where the surname is first, and the personal name is second. And sometimes people think, oh, well, that's just a kind of naming tradition, but actually it's more than just the symbolic. It's really about the fact of actually my primary identity comes through my familial, my family association, and me as an individual comes second. Some of these issues are really, really complex, and they're not kind of like pure differences in values. As I said to you, human beings absorb, integrate, and indigenize responses to different cultural traditions that have come in. It's not a situation where maybe a colonial country, an outside country, will come in and everybody stops their value systems and cultural practices. Sometimes these cultural practices, external cultural practices, are absorbed, they're adapted, they're indeed resisted. And even after the colonizers have left, again, there is these traditions are are living traditions, and there are all sorts of variations in these practices which we can't go into in today's class. I think what's important is to move beyond what's sometimes called a cultural competency framework, and sometimes there's training sessions on this to find out all about different cultures. And the danger about that is you can kind of almost be what's the word, kind of like fooled or kidding yourself that, yep, I've done that, I kind of know about, yeah, I've done my Chinese cultural competency training, or I've done my Islamic religious cultural competency training. And you can actually fool yourself in some sense that you've covered all the areas and you know it. My personal and research-based response to this is, I think actually it's more helpful to look at the idea of cultural humility. There are some things you can know, there is always more to know, and I guess ultimately it's okay that you can actually recognize that you don't know, and having an openness to listen and share. So again, I always wanted to go through this. This is like a little, sometimes you have to watch these charts just to kind of look at the differences between a Western view of self and a Confucian view of self. I should just say that there are different forms of Confucianism. So just these are always generalizations. They're useful. They can also be a little bit dangerous as well, because they can erase those differences. So in the West, for example, there is this idea of the self is constant and unchanging. There is such a person, they're an individual, and the human being, the sense of the essential self is part of the essence of one's existence. So it's the self is constant and changing, unchanging. So in Confucianism, there is this idea of Xi as the self is always something that you examine. It's this idea of one engaging in practices which are about self-criticism and self-development, and looking at one's moral and reflective behaviour. And the idea of the self then is about particular qualities and attributes, okay, rather than you as a form of substance. Okay, so let's kind of pull this apart a bit. In the Western sense of knowledge systems, okay, the self, this idea of reason being out there, the self is the thinking person, the contemplating self, and the idea that there is a soul or there is a mind. I should say to you, the idea of the soul is something that comes very much from Greek thought, although many of you might think it comes from the tradition, Christian tradition, but in fact it's where Greco-Roman thought actually was taken up by Christianity during the period of the early church. In the Confucian system of ourselves as knowledgeable beings, the self then is is this idea of an ethical subject that constantly scrutinizes. So the importance of kind of moral reflection, cultivation, introspective practices of self-improvement. And that's really, really valued within Confucian society, this kind of self-examination, and indeed sometimes even examination by others with a view of moral reflection, of knowledge growth through this ethical cultivation. Again, in the psychological sense, some of the values that, that we in the West would see that we are made up of feelings, emotions, memory, will, and knowledge, and that shouldn't be unfamiliar to you. And within a Confucian system, always the self, and I've already mentioned this earlier, the self is always a relational self, always relating to others. And in fact, the other becomes the mirror, reflecting back the stages of your own moral cultivation in relation to others and social communities. And in fact, in some Confucian societies, like in China, is this idea, because of this mirror, and it's almost like a dynamic dialogical relationship, is that communities, local communities, will engage in meeting in groups, engaging in this process of self-criticism and group criticism for the cultivation of ethics. And again, the glaring differences here around value systems is this idea of justice, social justice. We kind of assume that we know, yay, social justice, we know what it means. This has come back to this kind of intuitive thing. But actually, when we start looking at comparative systems, you'll find, hang on a minute, there's more going on. So in the West, the idea of justice is fairness. That's kind of John Rawls, who wrote a book called The Theory of Justice in 1972, which was the first modern example to secularize our understandings of what social justice might mean. Now, Rawls has been critiqued somewhat, but keeping it simple here, this idea of fairness, equality of opportunity, and this idea of justice is about the demand of fairness, that we should be having level playing fields. Yeah. In the Confucian system, then justice, however, is viewed along the lines of rightness, appropriateness. Should people be more justice associated with being humane and or benevolent? Attitudes towards the other, that people are brought together. The idea of justice then, for example, is understood in terms of that which promotes harmony. So that's huge difference, the idea of fairness and level playing field, in contrast with justice as harmony. Okay, just again, moving to the bottom left column, idea of fairness. So what does that mean? Giving to each what is due. Maybe distributive justice, how we distribute resources among different members of society, in contrast with the Confucian idea, bottom right hand side, this strong moral commitment to well-being, poor people and people in need. Sometimes there's the idea of merit, that if you provide for people in need, good feelings, a good future will come to you. There is a concept of distributive justice, but it's a different form of distribution. So we've got the distribution of the idea of honour. Now that's important. We talked about shame earlier, so the opposite, distribution of honour, offices. There's very much a kind of honorific system of high offices and positions within the community, distributions of punishment. And then the principles are quite different in terms of the idea of social equalities, social welfare, that there should be sufficiency for all. that sounds a little bit similar to the West, but here where it starts becoming a little bit different, there's priority to the badly off. So decisions are being made there. The idea of merit and contribution. So what you put in, what contribution you're making will determine some of these distributive aspects to justice. Okay, I finally want to move on to very, very briefly is the idea of different understandings of reality and the issue of depression in Buddhism. And I do want to say this is very, very generalized. There are different kinds of Buddhisms and there's certainly different kinds of depression. But let's have a look at this where what does depression mean within a religious tradition which views all of life as suffering? Now, we have the doctrine of what's called the Four Noble Truths, and this is a really short video of what the Four Noble Truths are. And basically why we're putting this on is it gives you a summary of how Buddhists and Buddhism understands the nature of the human experience.
The first noble truth of Buddhism is that suffering is an inescapable part of life. The legends say that when Gautama, who later became the Buddha, left his palace, he saw an old man, a diseased man, with a decaying corpse. He realized our lives include struggle, anguish, and pain. The second noble truth is that this suffering stems from the greed, ignorance, and hatred that arises in our minds, our craving to avoid the difficulties life throws. The third noble truth is that we can end all this if we can stop craving and respond differently. Doing so brings nirvana, or awakening, a state of complete wisdom and compassion for all beings. The fourth noble truth is the Buddha's recipe for achieving happiness, virtue, and eventually nirvana. It is the eightfold path of developing understanding, positive intentions, skillful speech, action, and livelihood, making the right kind of effort, cultivating mindfulness, and mastering meditation. The Buddha compared his teachings to a raft that a man uses to cross a raging river. Once you've crossed the river using the raft, once you've understood the truth of life for yourself, there's no point in remaining attached to it.
Right, so you get a sense then that within the Four Noble Truths, you might want to go back and review that video, that basically life involves suffering, and suffering comes from the idea of craving. I should just say to you, this word suffering is, it's translated from the original language, which is Pali, which is a religious language that's no longer in existence, but it really doesn't mean suffering. It talks about life. One of the symptoms of living is is dissatisfaction. So the idea of life is suffering. Life is accompanied by a sense of dissatisfaction. So what does that mean in terms of depression and Buddhism? So in traditional Western definitions of depression, particularly those which come from the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorder, which sees depression as a mental illness, as a disease that pathologizes that. And there are different forms of depression, but the traditional Western, I guess, approach describes depression as a state of generalized hopelessness, accompanied by feelings of distress, depression, anger, shame. So that, and this is a fairly broad categorization. So this sense of hopelessness is seen as to be have some degree of abnormalcy to it. As I said, to be kind of a mental illness, something that you would want to work on getting rid of, or indeed ameliorating, or at least improving the person. So there's some abnormalcy with this sense of depression. Now, again, I need to be careful here because there are different degrees and different categorizations of depression, both within the DSM and, in fact, the ICD-11. However, in Buddhism, these characteristics actually might be seen in terms of being a good Buddhist. What do I mean by that? Well, there's this idea then of self-awareness. In Buddhism, becoming aware that all of life is unsatisfactory, and that unsatisfactoriness is often caused by a gap between cravings, desiring what you want, and if you even obtaining those things can also result in further dissatisfaction. So the idea within Buddhism, and again I'm going to be a little bit glib about this, is you might crave and desire a big screen TV, and you're feeling anger and resentment towards other people who've got a big screen TV. You're saving up for it, you finally get it over a period of time. And often what happens with consumer goods is that moment of elation of satisfaction is only temporary, because actually you go on and decide that you want an Apple Watch, for example, or something else. So this idea that craving is never satisfied, and in fact this kind of inner battle between desire and craving causes suffering, causes dissatisfaction. So in Buddhism then, if an individual through meditation and training and education and introspection develops a sense that actually life is hopeless, and unsatisfaction is dissatisfaction, but feeling that life is suffering is a normal part of the human existence, and indeed in accepting suffering as part of life, that is a way forward, towards self-growth and enlightenment. That will be seen as a good thing. So in the Four Noble Truths, and again, go back and have a look at that, because Stephen Fry does go through that a little bit too quickly for my liking, but it does certainly give you a sense of what that's about. And there's if you want to know more about the Four Noble Truths, just do a Google search, and there's some good summaries that are around. But this idea that our own experience, we're constantly kind of cruising through life with this sense of hopelessness, and the nature of the world is a world that is constantly changing. The idea that we are born, and from the moment our birth, we kind of move through a process of decay to death. So things like, the Buddha talks about the fact that illness, disability, and aging aren't aberrations, they're part of the normal cycle of existence. So how does this manifest itself? And I mentioned before that religion is not compartmentalized in Asian societies. It often manifests itself through knowledge systems and a way in which people understand fortune and fate, the way businesses are run, the way schools work. And I should say, even in societies which nowadays maybe might not be ostensibly even regarded as religious. So you need to look at things like the People's Republic of China, is a communist country where religion has been I was going to say banned, but not banned. Basically, it's a secular system. There is some permissible religion, but it definitely has, its influences officially has been diminished. But actually, and I've had these conversations with Chinese students of mine, where Confucian values actually are totally inculcated within the way things are done, the idea of Chinese characteristics, without it being named as Confucian or indeed Buddhist. So you can actually have these values existing within Asian communities, even if they're not even these days identified as religious in their origin. So the ideology then is that life is suffering and sorrow. In some societies, there is a sense, particularly because of the multi-life narratives, their particular station in life is as a consequence of previous action. But I think it's really important here, there's not an issue of fatalism here. These values really talk about the idea that then you have an opportunity then through right acts, right thinking, right living to actually change and improve your life. And I think the important thing about this idea of depression then is that suffering and sorrow, and indeed depression itself, is caused by attachments and desire. And however, there's always a way out of this. So this is not something you're stuck with by this idea of attachment and desiring and craving things. There is a way out by changing one's behavior, and changing one's behavior to reduce the ignorance. And within Buddhism, there is a methodological strategy. It's a values system, but it's also a strategy. It's called the Eightfold Noble Path, and you'll find this within Buddhism. Often there are numbers, so we've got the, Four Noble Truths, and now we've got the Eightfold Noble Path. And again, if you have a look at that up, it is literally a manual, an instruction manual about how to enable individuals, through living a particular virtuous life and particular responses to how we process experience, to move through so that we can get ourselves out of this cycle of attachment. It is possible while life is suffering. It is possible through the processes of enlightenment, removing ignorance, living the Eightfold Noble Path to actually reduce suffering. So then you have this idea that painful effects aren't free floating. It's just not something that just happens because it happens, but pain and suffering are produced and understood within the context of a larger field, a larger plane about existence and why things happen. And I guess the final thing about this I want to say, which can be quite challenging then, is that mental illness is not always understood in terms of the individual as an individual pathology, something that resides within the person. Sometimes certain understandings of mental illness, ideas, for example, about possession, are understood as communal. So the experience of stress, depression, and other kinds of mental health issues are community experiences. And you only need to look at that in terms of some of the kind of documentations around communal patterns of suicide within village communities. And I've already mentioned this earlier, is that in the West, we have particular ways and they become very dominant. And remember, these systems come out of thinking systems, but then the very structure of these systems, these classificatory systems, then shape and influence our own thinking about what is normalcy, what is health, what is mental health, and how do we kind of refer to people. The ICD-10, actually this needs to be updated. It says ICD-11 now, International Classification of Diseases. It's often mainly followed in Scandinavian and European countries and in the UK. But we've got this DSM, which tends to be interestingly followed in countries that are allied of the USA. I think in terms of values about what is normal and what is abnormal, it's quite interesting. There's been some interesting research done by two authors, Cutchin and Kirk, who talk about the DSM going from 50 pages now to 500 plus. So it's quite interesting about this kind of growth of classification and categorization. Another example I want to pull out is just some of the other cultural meanings that we give to behavior. So this kind of, like in the Sri Lankan and Indian cultural context, this notion of what's called Lajabaya, which is about kind of what I call a deferent culture, the idea of being sedate, this fear, shame, this idea of thinking about, well, what will people think? What will people say? And there is definitely kind of a socialized and gendered reality there of obedience and waiting back and always wondering what people will think to do. Sometimes that's can get easily misinterpreted that somehow the person is feeling very subordinate. There's a very different relationship to hierarchies and cultures, the role of families, for example. What's sometimes called filial piety, obedience to parents, but it also may include obedience to your teacher or to your employer, very hierarchicalized system of where there's operation of fear and shame. I've talked about the fact that illness isn't necessarily of individual. I think this idea then that we all experience depression the same way, even if it's culture bound, we need to kind of look at this. Even sometimes the ideas about expression of what happiness is, what it means, and indeed, even if we were to look at markers of happiness, are we actually experiencing the same kind of emotional, you know, loss? And you might get different kind of ideas of disease. And I've put an example up here. This is to wake you up at this stage, is this idea of a disease in some of South Asian countries, of a disease, what's called semen loss. I don't think that there is that disease in the US or the UK. You know, if you've got semen loss, then it's fused with other issues. It might be to do with, you know, a man's ability to produce a child, to get a woman pregnant. I mean, it's usually linked to something else. The other aspect is, I guess, an orientation in terms of worldview, that kind of very Western kind of progress, upbeat, optimistic view. Anyone can make it if they try hard enough. With more of a pessimistic view of the world, that kind of all of life is struggle and suffering. And I think the point to make here is a pessimistic view of the world is not necessarily backward, depressive, or negative. So some of the things we have to do, you know, with our kind of challenging and openness to other value systems is to look at where we're getting information from. So we need to look at, you know, if we're trying to look at alternatives to Western values, is to kind of bring those values that are on the outside, so things outside the West, and move them to the center of our analysis. So instead of kind of like saying, oh, look, we're going to do, you know, values 101, and then we'll add cultural diversity, then we'll add religious diversity, then we'll add disability or whatever, that we need to kind of bring these so-called marginal frames into our analysis and look at how we can learn from that. We need to recognize, in fact, that there are different modalities, different kinds of concepts of the self. In the West, there is this idea of possessive individualism. You know, I am my own command center, you know, me, myself, I. And in fact, autonomy and independence is a really highly valued sense of self in the West, to this idea of a relational self, or indeed a sense of non-self in some Western Buddhist traditions, and the idea of family kin relations. So all these things affect different senses of identity, the idea of liberation and the idea of self-determination. In terms of research, but also in terms of practice, there are new knowledges that can be created that re-look at our sense of what it means to be human. I think we need to be very careful about the universalization of knowledge and look at what is gained and what is lost. It's very easy to lose non-Western values, particularly if we don't even know about them in the first place, and we don't fully engage and appreciate this. I just wanted to throw in, as we kind of come to a close in this, is that, you know, again, within Western traditions, this idea of individuals being rights bearers in law, having legal personality too. You know, there are other ways of seeing rights bearers. There's more communal aspects, the idea within the international norms that sentient other living beings can be rights bearers. Indeed, there's been a number of cases in recently that have actually given land and rivers the status of rights bearers to the same level that humans have. And of course, there are ongoing debates about within human rights conferences and within human rights communities about the priority and the relationship and importance of individual rights in contrast with collectivist or communal rights, sometimes referred to as social and economic rights. People have different concepts of space and tradition. So there's a whole bunch of references there if you want to look this up, and if there's any particular questions that you have, please get in contact with me. There are a number of videos that are around on YouTube. I would really recommend if you do a YouTube search and put in cultural humility. There's a fantastic, it is an American video, but it's a fantastic video of a way of integrating cultural humility into your professional practice. It was originally designed by a bunch of women working in the healthcare system, but it's actually been taken up also within social work practice. So as I said, if you put in cultural humility into your search engine, that will come up, and I would recommend that you watch that video. Okay, I'll see you all next time.